Welcome. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Paul Renfro. I'm an assistant professor of history here at Florida State University. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Christopher James Bonner, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Maryland, College Park. He is the author of Remaking the Republic, Black Politics and the Creation of American Citizenship, which was published last year by the University of Pennsylvania Press. And his talk today is titled Runaways or Citizens Claimed as Such. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Christopher Bonner.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks everybody for coming out today. I'm gonna talk for 25 or 30 minutes or so. I'm really glad to be here and to have this chance to share some of my work. I'll talk for 25 or 30 minutes, and I'll talk first about some of the big ideas that move through my book and some of the forms of Black politics that I think are important or worth considering in the antebellum period. And then I'll talk at the end a little bit about a new project that I'm beginning to develop, and so I'm excited to share some of that, which I don't get a chance to do very often. So I'm going to share a screen, and we'll hope that it's working okay. So typically when I talk about the book, I start with the question: what does citizenship mean to you? What does it mean to say a person is a citizen? Often when I ask these kinds of questions, I get a wide range of answers. People might talk about specific rights that citizenship confers. They might mention broader benefits of the status, things like access to the law. They might talk about access to physical territory, the space that's claimed by a national government. Or they might talk about intangible things, stuff like belonging to a nation or belonging in a community. And I think it's important that there are so many different approaches to this question. Citizenship remains contested ground. Today, at the same time that people are trying to claim particular rights as citizens, others are working to deny certain groups access to the benefits of citizenship. It's also important that even when people don't agree on what exactly citizenship means, they tend to have strong ideas about it. People do seem to agree that citizenship is a significant marker of a person's legal identity, that it offers tangible and intangible benefits. People generally agree that citizenship is a thing worth fighting for. None of these qualities of citizenship are new. Since the beginning of the United States, people have disagreed about the precise terms of citizenship, even when they agreed that it was a valuable thing. My book tells a series of stories about Black Americans pushing their way into that fight in the early 19th century. I write about free Black people who made claims about what citizenship meant in hopes of changing the legal terms of their lives in the United States. In their words and actions, Black people made radical arguments about citizenship, and they did critical work to shape the nation's legal development, even while those in positions of power denied them a voice in the lawmaking process. So, a little context about Black life in the early 19th century. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, several northern states took steps to gradually abolish slavery. New York's gradual abolition law said that enslaved people born after July 4th, 1799 would be free once they reached age 25 for women or age 28 for men. These kinds of laws slowly created a free Black population in the northern states. But at the same time, lawmakers limited Black freedom in profound ways. The US Congress excluded Black men from the military, and many states similarly barred Black men from militias. Ohio required free Black people to put up a $500 bond before they could settle in the state. New York allowed Black men to vote only if they owned $250 worth of real estate. And this was particularly onerous because most Black people who lived in New York were renters because they lived in New York City. So real estate was a really high hurdle. Faced with these restrictions, Black people turned to citizenship in pursuit of justice. The word citizen appeared 11 times in the original US Constitution, and you can see here a few of its uses. And the one I've highlighted is what I think is one of the most significant, which is that citizenship protected and does protect an undefined set of privileges and immunities. So the document, especially in this clause, implied that citizenship could be an important factor in determining a person's legal life, but it didn't name the rights or the obligations of the status. It also didn't say who could be a citizen. So this uncertainty was powerful for Black activists. No law said African Americans could not be citizens, so Black people insisted that they were, and they demanded legal protections under the status. Citizenship was a flexible and potent tool for Black activists. And when they claimed rights as citizens, they contributed to ongoing conversations about the relationships linking individuals and governments in the US. So this is the process that I refer to in the book's title. Here we go. Black folks were remaking the Republic. They were doing work that could change the nation's legal foundations. When we think about citizenship, or when I think a lot of people think about citizenship, one of the things that first comes to mind is the right to vote. And this was true for a lot of the people that I write about in the book. In 1866, a group of Black New Yorkers said, "To every man, the ballot is his protection from oppression and wrong, and his shield from the contempt of his fellow men." So suffrage was foundational. It was critical to African Americans' political concerns. But Black politics was complex. It was, people had concerns far beyond formal political access. And so the story that I want to tell today is about a man named William Dixon, and it offers us another angle on Black politics. Dixon's story helps us to look beyond the vote. It offers a fuller sense of the strategies and the objectives of African American politics in the early 19th century. William Dixon's name emerged in the historical record after he was arrested. He was taken to jail in New York City on a spring morning in 1837. Dixon had left his home on the Bowery and was headed to work when a stranger grabbed him and brought him before a judge. Arriving in the courtroom, the stranger made his claim. The Black man who called himself William Dixon was actually a fugitive slave named Jake. Allegedly, this person, Jake, had run away from Baltimore Dr. Walter Allender 5 years earlier in 1832. In court, the slave catcher referred to Dixon as Allender's Jake. So he was a man called Jake, allegedly, who was the property of Dr. Allender. Authorities brought Dixon to a cell in the crumbling jail called Bridewell, and they held him there for a week. And then on the morning of April 12th, 2 sheriffs escorted Dixon from Bridewell to City Hall in New York, just about a half a block away, a short distance across a plaza. And there in City Hall, he would have another hearing before Judge Richard Riker. Under New York law, a single judge could decide whether an alleged fugitive would remain free or be sent into bondage. Judge Riker had a reputation for being a friend to slave owners. He had frequently ruled in their favor and allowed alleged fugitives to be taken to the South. Standing before Judge Riker, the accused man protested his arrest. He insisted that his name was William Dixon. And he said this, "It is hard, Your Honor. It is hard to be thus treated in this land of liberty. I'm an innocent man. I'm a free man. It is hard to be torn from my family and thrust into prison like a dog. I demand justice of Your Honor." Riker called for a recess to decide the man's fate, and the sheriffs took Dixon by the arms to escort him back to his cell. New York's City Hall stands today as it did on that April afternoon. Here we are, in the middle of an 8-acre park in Lower Manhattan. This is one of a few pictures that I took when I was on a research trip. When I was in grad school, I realized that City Hall in New York now is the same building that it was in 1837. So I went and took some pictures. So after his hearing on April 12th, the sheriffs prepared to lead William Dixon across the park to Bridewell. Flanking the captive, they walked down a grand staircase, here we are, toward the building's main entrance. But as they ushered Dixon toward the doors of City Hall, they would have looked through the large windows that lined the front of the building and seen a massive crowd waiting outside. During the hearing, more than 1,000 African Americans gathered on City Hall Plaza. The sheriffs were apparently unconcerned. But as soon as they stepped outside, the crowd rushed forward. Several people attacked the sheriffs with wooden clubs. A Black woman standing at the front of the crowd drew a knife from under her dress and handed it to William Dixon. At first, the alleged fugitive wasn't sure what to do. He was shocked while these strangers fought for his freedom. But eventually, he overcame this sort of stunned feeling, and he ran west toward Broadway. Then he turned north to seek shelter in the busy city streets. The crowd continued to fight with authorities. One official ran outside to support the sheriffs, but a newspaper source says that a strapping Negro wench grabbed him in a chokehold, and a group of young Black men pretty well pummeled him and tore the coat completely off his back. So while this is happening, Dixon kept moving north along Broadway. A man on horseback tried to stop him, but Dixon now had a new escort, several Black men armed with clubs. They protected the fleeing prisoner. When he reached Duane Street, which was just a few blocks from City Hall, Dixon opted to take cover, ducking into a coal cellar to wait out the pursuit. His freedom here was short-lived. A few hours later, a witness tipped off authorities and they stormed the cellar, seized William Dixon, and carted him back to Bridewell. So this map is from a similar period. The black dot is about the location of City Hall. The green dot is Bridewell, and the red dot is where Dixon eventually stopped. So he didn't go all that far, but there he was. This attempt to rescue William Dixon reflected an important thread in Black and anti-slavery politics of the period. The white abolitionist Henry Clark Wright was dismayed that alleged fugitives seemed to have to work harder to prove their cases than alleged slave owners did. Wright said, "Here is the great difficulty in all cases of runaways or citizens claimed as such. The whole burden of proof is thrown on the colored man." One Black New Yorker argued that if the citizen of a free state was claimed as a slave, he or she should be entitled to a jury trial to determine their status. Vocal Black and white activists insisted that alleged fugitives were citizens and that citizenship must protect free people from being sent into bondage. This rhetoric was intended to urge lawmakers to enact measures that would defend an individual's freedom, even if that individual was a Black person. But the reality was that William Dixon was held captive by a legal system designed to preserve slavery. The US Constitution empowered slave owners to reclaim fugitives who fled to another state. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 said slave owners could cross state lines to pursue runaways, and theoretically, it also allowed them to arrest free Black Northerners who they suspected of being fugitive slaves. Also, the simple fact that enslaved people were so valuable meant that Black Northerners lived in a precarious freedom. They might be seized mistakenly by slave catchers or maliciously by kidnappers. Kidnapping endangered all Black Northerners, which helps to explain why so many people gathered on City Hall Plaza to try to rescue William Dixon. Black New Yorkers had a history of organizing to defend their freedom. In 1835, an interracial group of abolitionists established the New York Committee of Vigilance, or the NYCV. They called for new laws to protect free Black people, and at the same time, they aided known fugitives who had come north looking for safety. They called this work practical abolition. They were doing concrete things that they thought would fight slavery and the dangerous implications of the institution. Samuel Cornish was a leader in the NYCV, and he was also the editor of The Colored American, a newspaper that printed its first issue just a few weeks before Dixon's arrest. He might have thought this was good timing because he ended up with a lot of dramatic events to cover in the first month or so that he was writing. Although I was also just reading Jessica Lepler's book, The Many Panics of 1837, and I had forgotten that The Colored American, or I didn't realize that The Colored American debuted at the moment that the Panic of 1837 was beginning. But that's another story. So like others in the Vigilance Committee, Samuel Cornish said that alleged fugitives should have the protection of jury trials. But one of the most interesting things about his writing from this time is that Cornish was extremely critical of the violent effort to liberate Dixon. Cornish said the crowd was nothing more than a multitude of illiterate people. From his perspective, these people weren't acting in a calculated way in pursuit of progress. Instead, the crowd had become mere subjects of passion. There was some legitimacy to his concerns. There were NYCV lawyers leading Dixon's defense. Cornish's hope was that the lawyers would convince the judge to grant Dixon a jury trial, and that decision might set a precedent, and that other lawmakers would have to follow that and therefore create broader protections for Black people in the northern states. Cornish's concern was in part that a mob rescue of Dixon wouldn't have this same legal potential. But beyond this concern about political tactics, Cornish seemed particularly outraged that African Americans had done something he felt was uncivil. He was especially displeased that women had played prominent roles in the attempted rescue. He said those activist women had degraded themselves. And he added this: "We begged their husbands to keep them at home for the time to come and find some better occupation for them." So as you can see in this image, Cornish's message on the mob was addressed to the thoughtless part of our colored citizens. He promoted narrow ideas about who could do meaningful, productive Black political work. Black women were often denied the chance to make their voices heard in Black newspapers and in public meetings during the 19th century. Men like Cornish had restrictive ideas about gender. They thought political activity wasn't appropriate for women. And to me, this is one of the things that makes it really fascinating, the shape that the attempted rescue took. This kind of politics offered Black women a particular opportunity to express their ideas in public. I like thinking about, where are we? There we go. I like thinking about the woman who stood at the front of the crowd during the rescue, the woman who reached under her dress and pulled out a knife for William Dixon. She did this because she thought it would help secure his freedom. Maybe in part of her mind, she was relishing the opportunity to step outside of what many thought was proper women's work. Or maybe she had done this many times before. Maybe she had long ago rejected Samuel Cornish's ideas about what kind of behavior was acceptable for women. It's really tough to know this woman's particular activist history, and part of that is because we don't even know her name. But what we do know is important. She chose to take a critical role in Dixon's rescue, and none of the people in the crowd stood in her way. Black women carved out opportunities to make their voices heard, despite some people's efforts to silence them. This woman's actions reflect some important truths about the attempted rescue. African Americans believed Dixon deserved a fair hearing, and they were convinced that the legal structures that were in place would not provide it. The mob action was about defending Dixon's freedom, but it was also about more than any single Black person. Attacking sheriffs and judges in order to liberate an alleged fugitive was a protest against the legal structures that imperiled all Black people's freedom. Breaking the law was a critical form of Black politics. Through their actions, the crowd outside of City Hall added their voices to those calling for a different legal order in the US, one that would protect Black freedom as robustly as it defended slave owners' property rights. So breaking laws was one way Black activists highlighted injustice and demanded legal protections. And thus, despite what Samuel Cornish wrote, these folks were far from thoughtless. So here I want to draw, and one of the things that I like to do when I talk about the project is partly think about the context in which I finished it. Over the past several years, people across the country have gathered to protest police brutality. And often they've been motivated by videos that document police killings of African Americans. Some of these protests have involved forms of violence that many vocal figures, including President Obama, have criticized for not fitting in with ideas about what forms of Black politics were acceptable. So Obama in the summer of 2020 said of various protests happening around the country, we should condemn the few who resort to violence. People made similar arguments about Black protests, or have been making these arguments for decades, really. People made similar arguments in particular after uprisings in Baltimore and Ferguson in 2014 and 2015. Again, in those cases, police officers killed Black people, Michael Brown in Ferguson, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and people took to the streets to denounce longstanding, unchecked police brutality. At the time, many observers condemned those movements as violent, destructive, unruly, or unproductive. And we can see a couple of examples from this in my local paper, The Washington Post, from April 2015. The idea of peaceful protest shifts focus back to death of Freddie Gray. And so the implication here is that violence was not an expression of outrage about Gray's killing. Or a column from June of 2016 with a headline that begins with the premise, rioting makes no sense. But our work should be to try to make sense of it. Violent forms of protest often reflect protesters' political thought. The project of racial justice is not served by blanket criticisms of the forms of protest. Instead, we should try to continue trying to understand the concerns that can produce violent, law-breaking protests, and to try to take seriously the intellectual and political work that these protests can do. So I think that I'm trying to do this kind of work in my exploration of the 19th century. I'm trying to ask questions about why people turn to violence in the effort to liberate William Dixon. Where are we? If we can see political thought and expression in the violent, unruly attempt to rescue Dixon, we should try to do the same for violent, unruly forms of contemporary politics. Why might Black Americans choose certain avenues of political expression? What forms of Black thought are represented in collective, public acts of lawbreaking? Making sense of these political acts can lead us to see the truth that certain legal structures might need to be broken in order to bring people closer to justice. So I want to turn back to Dixon's story. In the days after the failed rescue attempt, Dixon's trial continued. His counsel called a number of witnesses, including a white ship captain who testified that he had employed Dixon occasionally since 1831, and a Black barber from Philadelphia who said he had known Dixon as a free man for 15 years. Walter Allender, who was Dixon's alleged owner, had to prove a difficult case. The slave called Jake had allegedly run away in 1832, so none of his witnesses could claim to have seen the man for at least 5 years. They then had to prove that after all that time, they could identify 1 out of the 20,000 free and enslaved African Americans who lived in Baltimore. Judge Riker refused to deliver a prompt decision. He left Dixon to sit in a cell for 3 months. Perhaps he spent that time anxious that his decision might lead to more violence on the street. Finally, in July 1837, William Dixon's lawyers secured a writ that allowed him to go free on bail. Under the terms of this writ, Dixon would have to return to court if the judge called him, but in any subsequent hearing, a jury would determine his fate. So the writ allowed Dixon to return to his life in New York, and it offered an important new layer of legal protection against his enslavement. Judge Riker responded favorably to the arguments of the NYCB, and the case might have set a valuable precedent for protecting other alleged fugitives in the time to come. In Dixon's story, we can see how people who were denied formal political rights were able to insert their voices and ideas into the spaces where laws were being made. And in one sense, my story is, my book is all about stories like this. Free African Americans insisting that they should have a role in the lawmaking process and finding creative ways to push their way in. In New York, Black people learned the law and they risked their lives in defense of one another. And for a brief moment in the 1830s, members of the crowd that rescued William Dixon shaped the local lawmaking process just as much as a voter might do at the ballot box. So the last thing I'll share about this project is a little epilogue to Dixon's story, and it offers another angle on understanding Black politics in this period. Dixon was released from jail, but he was living in a state of anxiety. He could still be called back to court, or he might be arrested again, or he might be kidnapped. His daily life was a tense experience, and perhaps no single encounter was more frightening than a chance meeting with a runaway slave from Maryland. In his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, Frederick Douglass described the morning when he arrived in New York City in 1839. He disembarked from a train just after having escaped from Baltimore. Douglass was lost and lonely, wandering the streets of Lower Manhattan, so he felt overjoyed when he bumped into a Black man he remembered from Baltimore, a man he recognized as Allender's Jake. "I knew Jake well," Douglass wrote. He had heard that Dr. Allender had sent slave catchers after the runaway, but Douglass was glad to see that Jake seemed to be thriving in freedom. Jake was less than pleased to run into this particular old friend. He announced to Douglass, "I am William Dixon in New York," and he quickly walked away, leaving the more recent runaway alone in an unfamiliar city. So Douglass's narrative leads to or raises a few more questions about Dixon's story. One is, who knew the truth of Allender's Jake? The Black New Yorkers who tried to rescue him understood how difficult it was for any African American to secure freedom through the law. Regardless of whether they knew Dixon was Jake, they knew there were limits to the justice available to him, and they took steps to challenge that reality. Did the NYCB lawyers know that they were defending a fugitive? If they did, then Dixon and his defense team broke the law repeatedly, brazenly, from inside of City Hall. That law breaking might help move toward a precedent that would create new legal protections for Black freedom. The lawyers recruited witnesses, Black and white, who were willing to lie in court in an effort to protect African Americans. For all his condemnation of the attempted rescue, it also seems likely that Samuel Cornish, who was a leader in the Vigilance Committee, also knew the truth. This may be why he was so angry about the City Hall mob. Perhaps he knew how much work had been done in court, and he was exasperated that a protest might disrupt a case with all this legal potential. The legal case of the runaway slave Jake appears to have involved a series of acts of law breaking that took place both in and outside of City Hall. And finally, why did this man lie so ardently about his freedom? And why did he seem to think it would work? Maybe this was a simple choice for a person desperate to be free. William Dixon was a character, a performance of freedom enacted in the courtroom and on the streets. It was a high-wire act of lawbreaking. His story shows us how well Black people understood the law. It shows us how effectively they manipulated and moved through legal structures, making transformative claims about citizenship, rights, and justice. In the 1830s, African Americans deftly navigated the legal landscape of New York, working in print, in court, and in the streets to transform a fugitive slave called Allender's Jake into a free man named William Dixon. So my first book is about the lives of free Black people in the North and the work that they did to enrich that freedom. I say my first book as though there's a second, but the book that I've finished is about free Black people. The new project I'm working on is different, but I still think that in a way I'm engaging with questions about African American freedom in the 19th century. I'm exploring the story of a man named Moses Grandy, who was born into slavery in North Carolina in the 1780s and spent much of his adult life trying to purchase his freedom. Through Grandy, I want to raise questions about how enslaved people experienced and navigated the exploitative economy of the 19th century South. And I also want to think about what freedom meant to Black and white Americans in the early United States. There's a moment in Grandy's narrative that reflects some of these big questions. So I'll tell another little story here about Moses. One day, Grandy guided a boat north along the Dismal Swamp Canal, crossing from North Carolina into Virginia, bound for business in Norfolk. He was carting lumber, and he navigated with care because the canal at this point was essentially a narrow ditch. By this point in his life, Grandy had learned through hard experience the value of his time and his work. Sometime after the War of 1812, and after several years of diligent, profitable labor, Grandy had paid his owner $600, a sum they had agreed was an appropriate price for Grandy's freedom. But the slave owner pocketed the money and destroyed receipts for the payments, refusing to liberate a man who had proven so valuable. And so Grandy remained enslaved, forced to continue enriching his owner. In Norfolk, Grandy walked into a storehouse belonging to Moses Myers, a merchant with whom he had worked during the War of 1812. When the British blockaded the coast, the Dismal Swamp Canal was the only path for maritime commerce and supply between Virginia and North Carolina. And enslaved boat pilots like Grandy did crucial work for the fledgling nation. Myers thus thought of the enslaved man with respect, perhaps even admiration. So Grandy may not have been surprised that day to hear Myers praise him in a conversation with another white Virginian. "Now, there is a captain doing business for you," Myers announced to his companion. Myers' friend was curious about this business-minded African American. And Grandy later recalled that the man, who introduced himself as Truett, asked who had sent Grandy on his errand and, more importantly, to whom I belonged. The enslaved boat pilot offered a terse response. "I had belonged to Mr. James Grandy, but had bought myself." To Moses Grandy, it was critical to frame his relationship with James Grandy as a feature of his past. In a few words, he suggested a rich personal history, hinted at his capacity to do valuable, skilled work, and revealed that he still hoped to be free despite his owner's greed and duplicity. But when he used the past tense, Grandy spoke less than the truth. He had paid for himself, but had not in fact purchased his freedom. Standing in Myers' store, Moses belonged to James Grandy, a fact Truett recognized. So Truett postured for Myers and for anyone else within hearing, announcing that he would buy Moses Grandy. Soon afterward, he did. Grandy's effort to purchase his freedom was a product of the slaveholding economy and the geography of his mid-Atlantic coastal home. After his first owner died during Grandy's childhood, young Moses was hired out to various other white men in the region. One of these men was Enoch Sawyer, who operated a ferry and had Grandy trained as a boatman. Another, Richard Furley, allowed Grandy to hire himself out, and that process enabled the enslaved man to see the value of his labor and to build business relationships that he would later deploy in the effort to purchase his freedom. Grandy would come to rely on a few white men in that arduous process, but we can't separate their openness to that social connection from the money he brought them through his skilled labor. Charles Grice, for instance, first encouraged Grandy to buy his freedom, but did so only after Grice recognized how swiftly Grandy could navigate the canal to their mutual benefit. Each time Grandy contracted to buy his freedom, he worked doggedly toward that end. Digging his way out of enslavement necessarily swelled the profits he brought to his hirers and owners. And all of this had costs for Grandy. After the second time he was cheated out of his payments, Grandy felt unhinged. My head seemed to turn round and round, he later wrote. I was quite out of my senses. As he looked to earn his way out of slavery, he surely worked at a particularly grueling pace, and it seems the process afforded him less access to the tools of daily negotiation that other enslaved people deploy. So I'm interested in thinking about Moses Grandy's story just to sort of help make further sense of and develop some of the things that he wrote in a narrative that was published in 1843. Recent histories have explained how the antebellum economy came to exist and outlined the structures that constrained enslaved people's lives within that economy. But much of the scholarship has overlooked questions about the ways slaves thought about those structures and the strategies Black people used to navigate them. As Moses Grandy worked toward his freedom, the enslaved boat pilot thought carefully about his relationships to slave owners and merchants and how he might leverage his skills and personal connections to pursue his aims. So Grandy's story offers it offers insight into a particular thread in the history of enslaved people's politics. Moses Grandy's story helps us to see how enslaved people came to think about and value capital, how they acquired it, and how they used it. He thus helps us make sense of individual experiences of the larger economic forces that drove the history of the antebellum United States. So I'll stop there. Thank y'all for coming out again and giving me this chance to share my work. I'll stop sharing the screen. And I look forward to any and all questions that you might want to throw my way. As long as the question is not, when are you going to finish that next thing? Because it's, work.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chris. And I know that Max Schultz has a question, so I can turn it over to him. And of course, if anybody else has a question, feel free to raise your hand.
Oh, Lord.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm not driving. I pulled over specifically for this, Chris. See, hands, well, that doesn't prove anything. But anyway, I do have a question. First of all, thank you so much for this talk. And I've bought 2 copies of your book, as you know, and by accident, and have enjoyed reading it. I have a question for you about the legal ambiguity that you described. I found it really surprising that legal ambiguity would be, I think you used the word, a tool that individuals could use to assert their freedom. And that struck me as really counterintuitive. I would think that legal ambiguity would be very bad in this situation. And just to bring this full circle, where I'm getting this from is that I recently encountered the work of someone who's a postdoc at UPenn named Brittany Farr, and she writes on contract law, on free and unfree people in the 19th century and contract law. And she basically contends that all this citizenship and con law stuff is just ambiguous. It's about morals, and it's ineffective in asserting Black rights. And that contract law, which is the uncool little brother of con law, is actually much more effective. And that
because of its specificity.
Because of its specificity, and because of the fact that white people also had a vested interest in keeping contract law pristine. And so I was wondering if you could say more about why in the world ambiguity would be helpful as a tool. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I hadn't thought about that contrast. I think that I could say a couple of things about that. One is that ambiguity is a tool for people who are generally marginalized. And the reality is that for Black folks in the antebellum period, their marginalization was dictated chiefly by state law. And so the ambiguity of federal law, the fact that New York law says y'all can't do X, but the federal law doesn't say that, means that maybe federal law might be used to supersede and to wipe out some of the restrictions, the exclusions that are being implemented at the state level. And so part of the project is about questions of federalism and federal versus state sovereignty. Black people were hoping, when they appealed to this idea of US citizenship, they were hoping that they could mold that law in a way that would wipe out the restrictive nature, restrictive dimensions of state law. So the ambiguity, I guess the simplest way to respond to this is that being ambiguously included or excluded is better than being explicitly excluded. And so that's a way to think about how ambiguity worked as a tool, is like it's better than the alternative. But the point that you make, and I think that the point about, I'd be curious to read some of the stuff about contract versus citizenship, essentially. But the point that you make is right, that the ambiguity of citizenship made it a flawed tool. All that it allowed Black people to do was to enter a contest, but the extent to which they won that contest is uncertain. The extent to which they got what they wanted through that contest is uncertain. And so part of the story that I tell in the book is that even when citizenship is formally conferred on African Americans during Reconstruction, the terms of the status are still uncertain. And so there, the ambiguity, which is, the breadth of citizenship is empowering because it allows people to make claims, to claim specific rights and to claim that they belong in that category. But it would be better if, like, a law said, yes, all people who are citizens have X, Y, and Z rights. If those rights were enumerated, that would be more secure for people who are in marginal positions. And essentially what happens is that Black people push themselves into situations, in the book that I'm writing, Black people push themselves into situations where they constrain themselves to secure citizen status. And so part of the story I tell in one chapter is about how Black people link moral programs like temperance to their efforts to secure the right to vote. And so they embrace this idea that, well, if you want to be a voter, if you want to prove yourself to be a good citizen, you can't drink alcohol. And so that the fact that they have to try to define citizenship leads them into ways where they create constraint in pursuit of rights, and therefore, I would argue, embrace injustice in pursuit of those rights. So that's a long and roundabout way of saying it's a tool because it's better than nothing, but it's a flawed tool. But thanks for that. That's a really I appreciate that question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you, Max. Thank you, Chris. And yeah, Anasa and then Jen.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was super interesting. I'm going to see if Max will lend me one of his 2 copies.
I think give is appropriate.
I didn't want to be too forward, but yeah, I think you should give it to me, actually. My question, well, first I'll say this is so interesting because I was actually in one of my classes today talking with my students about a reading they did. I talk about 20th century Latin America, but we were talking specifically about the possible value of protest that's understood to be violent in the 80s in Venezuela, a bunch of people in a slum hijacked garbage trucks and kidnapped the sanitation workers and demanded that they do their jobs because they hadn't been. And it worked, it was successful. And so, yeah, it's just an interesting coincidence. My
Yeah.
question is about when you first started talking about this case, I was immediately reminded of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which of course was a few years, a decade after the case that you're talking about. And it seemed to me that the lawyers and activists who were kind of hoping to set a legal precedent for demanding that possible alleged fugitives go before a jury, it seems to me that the Fugitive Slave Act kind of nullified that strand of activism because, of course, it just meant that, you know, would-be slave catchers from the South were just kidnapping people and taking them back to the South with no need for evidence or no kind of demand of any kind of legality on their part. And I wonder if that makes sense, if there is that kind of connection. And I also wonder whether those activists, the man you talked about who edited The Colored American, whether they, if that does make sense, whether they admitted to themselves that they had been perhaps naive or optimistic about the kind of possibility of the legal system protecting alleged fugitives. And I wondered if you thought that their counterparts, you know, the Black people who comprised the mob and gave Goodwin a knife and tried to help him escape, whether you have any sources that verbalize that they kind of, it seems that they implicitly understood that the fix was in and that there was no point in pursuing a legal case because property was always kind of going to win that battle.
Yeah. Thank you for that. These are really great questions. So I'm hearing two things generally. Like, one is like, what's the relationship between the story I'm telling and some of the federal legal change that was enacted to restrict fugitive slaves, and two, like, how are Black folks' ideas about the law developing across this period? So I think that there is a clear and strong connection between controversies like that of William Dixon and the Fugitive Slave Act, or Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. Generally, the Fugitive Slave Act was promoted and secured through the efforts of white Southern lawmakers who were so terrified of and so worried and angry about the number of people that seemed to be running away and the support that they were getting in the northern states. One of the things that precipitated the enactment of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850 was that northern states had passed laws that created various kinds of protections, like access to a jury trial, or like the insistence that free people shouldn't just be dragged off the street, that there needs to be some sort of process involved here. And I would argue that some of those northern state legal developments were a product of the work that Black activists were doing in cases like that of William Dixon. And those were Black activists who were on the street, making it hard for Riker to do what he wanted to do, and activists who were in the court lying and creating this character of William Dixon. So I think there is a thread linking these forms of Black politics to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And that's part of why I think these cases are interesting. The cases that I write about in that chapter of the book are interesting, but I also wrote about them in part because there has been a lot of focus on Black politics and fugitive rescues after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. But I thought it was interesting that there is this longer thread of history there, and it offers a different way of thinking about the relationship between law and activism. The other question I think is one of the things that I was writing is like, we're what you were saying is like, were activists admitting that they had been naive to expect that the law would be on their side? I don't know that I've seen it articulated in those terms, but I do think that there is much more. So after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, I think there's a much wider embrace of violence as politics, and really there's a much wider embrace of violent efforts to defend people from kidnapping or from arrest, whether they're legitimate or whether they're legally enslaved or not. I think maybe the most famous quotation from the period, Douglass at one point says, that the best way to make the Fugitive Slave Act a dead letter is to make 2 or 3 dead kidnappers. And there are moments in the 1850s where Black and white groups of abolitionists are fighting against and killing. There are mob actions where slave catchers are killed in northern states. There's also one of the stories I tell in my in the book is about a meeting that happens in New York in 1852, I believe, where activists are celebrating the number of fugitives that they're helping to free. So there's almost, I don't know that it's more public in the 1850s, but there is an understanding that in this case, we should be looking out for ourselves, and what the law says isn't going to help us, isn't going to matter. And so maybe there's a way in which those folks are recognizing, hey, you know what, Samuel Cornish was wrong. But I don't know that it's that neat of a break, of a change, because at the same time that Douglass is saying we have to make the Fugitive Slave Act a dead letter, Douglass is still appealing to this possibility of citizenship. Douglass is still remaining hopeful or optimistic in the idea that the US Constitution might come to include African Americans. And so there is simultaneously, in the same way that Dixon's case is both within and outside of City Hall, that the politics is happening there, there's simultaneously an effort to protect Black people at all costs or by any means from enslavement, and a broader project of among many people advocating for legal change that would give Black people a voice in formal government, and then might in turn allow them to help to produce legal protection, actual legal protections for themselves and for their communities. Does that make sense? Thank you for that. I appreciate that question.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anasa and Chris and Jen, and then Jojo.
I want to thank you so much for spending time on a Thursday afternoon with us. And one of the things I was thinking about was the politics of identity, like the establishing the science, I guess, of establishing identity. And one of the things I was thinking about, it's a little bit later, but I was thinking about Joyce Hatton Barnum and her performance of identity, right? That she's, well, it's not clear who's claiming, but the claim of her being 161 years old and being George Washington's nanny, and how do you prove identity, right? And in that case, it winds up being an autopsy.
Yeah.
So I wondered in your work if you saw in this period different ways that people went about establishing identity, because that seems also tied to citizenship of how do you prove your identity? So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Wow, this is something that I have never ever thought about, and I think it's fascinating because I talked about it here, right? That it's like who's gonna prove who William Dixon is, or who Allenders Jake is, and so I don't know that I can say a lot. I bet if I thought about this a little bit further, I would be able to come to something. I guess two things I think about, and these are one is not really related, but I think it's related to this question about identity more generally. I think that I'll say a couple of things. I think that it's interesting that they're bringing in these witnesses, and essentially what they're doing for Dixon is fabricating an identity. So one of the things I think is neat there is that they've got Black and white folks who are willing to make stuff up essentially and craft this character. But there are records. I've seen records from a vigilance committee in Pennsylvania wrestling with this problem, and there are records in their minute book that say that essentially watch out for pretenders. Black people were saying that they were being defrauded by other Black people who had claimed to be fugitive slaves and needed financial assistance to get out of the state or to get north. And so that's a way to say that that identity is a problem, and that Black people are in some cases not really sure how to wrestle with it. The other thing that I'm thinking about is not really directly related, but I'm just thinking about how how I see African Americans wrestling with identity in this period is the sort of like authentication statements that come with things like Douglas's narrative and other slave narratives. This claim by Douglas is introduced by Wendell Phillips and William Lloyd Garrison. So two prominent white men are here to say, not only did Douglas write this, which is, about white Americans' expectations of what Black people's capacities were, but also Douglas was actually a slave. He is actually who he says he is. And they claim to know that just because the story is so vivid, the details seem so compelling. That is a really great question, and I wish I could say more about it. But I do think there are moments when you can see people wrestling with it, and so I like proof of who one is important. It's another thing that comes up when you're teaching the market revolution with grad students, like I was the other day. Like who you can trust and how you can trust them is a big question from the period, but it's not something that I thought about really before now.
I was thinking, I think it's one of those things that's always in the backdrop because, right, I know for me, the things I study, it's like, how do you know that the milk that you're drinking is actually really milk?
Yeah. Or
it's not, it's something else. But in particular, I was struck, like, Joyce Heth is just 20 years later, and this argument about, and, we'll never really know why she participated, but the ability for African Americans to use those ambiguities, I think, but in different ways that the law is trying to nail down, how do you prove someone's identity, and the tools of that science as they change throughout the 19th century, I find to be a puzzle.
Yeah. And to Max's question, it cuts both ways, that the uncertainty of Black identity made it possible for free Black Northerners to be kidnapped, in the same way that it made it possible for them to put on a different identity in pursuit of freedom. Thanks for that.
Paul, can I just jump in?
Yeah, sure. If Joe doesn't mind.
Well, I have one sentence to say, Joe, I promise. It just occurred to me that it's sort of price for their pound of flesh, is sort of floating around there too, because the thing that I was thinking was that, you're enacting in a Northern courtroom something that gets enacted in the slave market and then, in enslavement all the time, which is that, white people regard, one of their great cultural powers is being able to say, I know who you are better than you do. Right. So I get
your traits, your capacity, your whatever it might be.
Or even like just somehow or I can change your name, right? Or I can do whatever, your identity. You don't actually have a static identity in that, because it's entirely flexible and at my discretion.
So the power to make a person, essentially.
Yeah. So I mean, even the idea of having a fixed identity, let alone being able to say, actually, I have several aliases and I'm using identity to get away from you, is just completely, I mean, I can't imagine that people who came north to find fugitives would have found that anything but just totally mind exploding.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it totally works against all of their assertions of power.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what Douglas does, is what name do you want to take, essentially, is the question. And there's the name you choose means particular things. And I think he says in the narrative, at one point, he's like, I wanted to be Frederick Johnson, but there were too many Johnsons in New Bedford. So it's cool.
Okay, so thanks, Chris, for your talk. It's really super interesting. I want to ask a question about interpretation and about, I guess, the act of interpreting behavior and violent behavior as a form of politics. And I'm struck by kind of the fact that the groups you're talking about are groups of people that you're interpreting as political actors, right? So they're not sort of solitary individual people. And they're also sort of, I think, they're groups of people doing things that we're sympathetic to, right? And so I guess I'm kind of wondering about how far you feel comfortable sort of extending the interpretation of politics to other sorts of actions.
Mhm.
And I'm asking this for a very self-centered reason. I'm trying to write a book on addiction and drug use in the early 19th century.
Mm.
And one of the things I'm coming up against sort of is our enslaved people in the North who kill their owners, right? And often in apparently like drunken fits, right? Or episodes of being very drunk.
Mm.
And so then they supposedly lose control of their passions or something like that, right? And end up and kill their masters, right? And then they get executed. And so these are sort of confessional narratives. It's not always clear who actually wrote them and all that kind of thing, right? But those are solitary acts, right? In a certain kind of way, they're individual people, and so I'm kind of struggling about how to interpret those or how to narrate those kind of episodes, right?
Like,
And
is this a challenge to slavery? Is this essentially the question?
yeah, or is it? I mean, is it within the temperance movement, right? Or the anti? I mean, like, is it right? Is it
I mean, the narratives.
Yeah, the narratives, right? But also the actions, if they like took place, like what do I say about them? I guess. I mean, they're horrible, but they're also, yeah. So I guess I'm kind of stuck. I was just really struck by sort of the collective versus individual binary and the sort of stories we're talking about.
Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot here that I'm thinking about. I guess one of the things that I'm thinking about is, so I don't think that the examples that I compared, the trying to liberate a fugitive and protesting police killing Black people. It's like, yeah, those are both things that I think are good. But I don't think that this way of thinking about violence as politics is limited to things that are good in general, right? Like the killing of Heather Heyer in Charlottesville, Virginia, that's politics, right? And I think it's important that part of the point that I want to make is that we don't really learn or gain anything by just saying, oh, violence is bad. So that's one of the things that I think broadly I'm saying is like, yeah, good, bad, however we feel about the impulse behind it, it's important to try to think about and make sense of an act of violence, what it meant to the perpetrator, why they chose that as a thing. I'm thinking about like Hannah Rosen's book, right? About the forms of violence as a sort of language of white supremacy, a process of trying to reconstruct white supremacy, essentially, or secure white supremacy in the 1860s and 1870s. There's horrific stuff narrated in Rosen's book. And I think she does really well to extract and understand the politics of it. I guess the other thing that I think is like saying something has political implications is just the first level. And so when I try to think about it, I'm thinking about slavery with my students or thinking about what I've written about here, the question is like, what did this thing mean? And so it meant something particular that there are 1,000 people there at City Hall to try to protest this thing. It also meant something particular, both to Samuel Cornish and to William Dixon and to the white sheriffs, that one woman at the front of the crowd had a knife and that she drew that out. And so the individual and collective are kind of coming together in this moment. And so there's political choices that are being exercised or being made by people in different parts of that. But it's like, what did this thing mean to the people who did it? For an enslaved person who killed a slave owner, what did it mean to do that? It meant that in that moment, maybe they had lost their senses because they were intoxicated in some form. Maybe it meant that they were able to express a deep desire to visit or perpetrate violence on a person who owned them and who had brutalized them. What it also meant was that in the end, they were killed. And so to say like, this is resistance, this is a challenge to slavery, yes, sure, if you want to think about that, but that statement doesn't encompass the breadth of what it actually meant to the person. So the last thing I'm thinking about in this case, and I'll stop. There's a clip from a video that I use with undergrads sometimes that is Anderson Cooper on the Henry Louis Gates show, Finding Your Roots. And Cooper finds out that one of his ancestors was a slave owner who was killed by an enslaved person, beaten to death with a hoe, I think is what the record says. And Cooper like does this weird thing where he laughs and says, wow, I think he deserved it. He says, like, I think the slave owner deserved it because he owned an enslaved person. And it's this very like simplistic way of thinking about what that actually meant, because it obscures, to me, it obscures two important things. One is that what Gates tells us is that eventually this person was executed, the enslaved person. And two, I think it obscures a reality of like what it would have felt like to either get to a point where you want to kill someone with a garden hoe, and what it would have actually felt like to do that to another human being. Like, so I think it's like saying like, yeah, like this is resistance, like I want to read it that way. It really flattens so much of the complexity of like that as an action that a human did to another human. And so that's like to me, that's like the bad way to read that kind of act of violence. And I think there's, just keep asking questions about it is what I tell the students. Is that sort of along?
Yeah, I mean, it does. Yeah, I mean, that helps, I mean, I'm really struck by sort of the recognition that you would die, right, as you did this, right? And sort of what that means.
Yeah. And it's think about like what Stephanie Smallwood writes about enslaved people committing suicide and on slave ships, and the complexity of her readings of that, I think is another really helpful way to think about, slave politics and what that involved.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joe and Chris. And I think we're coming to the end now, but if we maybe want to ask one or two more questions relatively quickly, we can do that. Will, I know you, Will, I think you had your hand up, and then Anasa.
Okay, well, thanks for the interesting talk. I'm a bit of an outsider, but I just had a little bit of thinking about, your conversation with Joe just now. And I guess something that, I mean, this is more of a comment than a question, but I'm really interested in the ability to, in protest, the sense that one can protest and break the law in protesting as a marker of citizenship, of effective citizenship. Because, I've worked on citizenship in the context of Egypt, and that kind of possibility seems to be very far off the table, or not something I've looked for. So I'm really struck by the story that you told. And I was thinking all the way through your discussion of, those 1,000 people in front of City Hall, of Carl Schmitt's definition of sovereignty being the ability to define the exception, like to say this law is not, we're going to step outside of that. We're going to step outside of that, of the law in this case, and make an exception. There's, that's a certain kind of confident citizenship, political citizenship practice, I guess, which is a kind of law breaking, which is a little bit different from, like, it seems like in your discussion with Joe, you guys were talking about two different kinds of resistance, right? Like these individual acts of violence, but then, then this protest of 1,000 is a different kind of sort of citizenship rights claiming. I'm sort of all over the place, but let me give a question so that I legitimize my blathering. So did these folks, these 1,000 people, face any repercussions that you found about for their protest, or were they secure in demanding an exception to the rule?
Yeah, so I can answer that briefly, and I haven't found anything that suggests that there was any legal response, and I think part of that is one of the things that's always seemed so odd to me about this story is that it's like you walk a guy across City Hall Plaza with just 2 sheriffs, and that's it, and they looked outside, and like you can't not see a huge crowd out there, but so I think that I don't know, I think there's something about the fact that there were so many of them suggests that it would have been really hard to try to enforce anything about this. And there's evidence of similar subsequent. So this was what happened with the rescue of William Dixon was not the first time in the mid to late 1830s that this happened in New York. And I doubt that it was the last. I also, on the point about like the relationship between violence as politics and citizenship, I think that I'm not suggesting that all violent politics were making that claim. And so I don't know that I would necessarily say that about the stories that Joe was reading, but I haven't read these texts. But what I think connected this violent politics to citizenship was the fact that Black activists were explicitly making the claim that Black people should be treated as citizens and provided with a jury trial. And so they're sort of amplifying that claim with their violence that is literally pulling William Dixon out of a legal proceeding that is denying him the right to a jury trial. So they're with their feet and their hands, they're rejecting the legal order as it existed. And that's why I think that's making a claim about rights. And that claim about rights was a claim about citizenship, given the ways that other Black activists were talking about it.
Thanks.
I see Anasa's chat, which I think sounds really interesting.
All right. Okay, so I guess we should probably wrap up because I know some folks want to get to Wei Wei's event. So can we give a round of applause for Chris and say thank you for joining us for a really wonderful talk. So thanks so much.
Thanks, y'all. This is cool. I don't talk to a bunch of other historians a lot, so it's cool to be able to. The questions are really great, so I'm happy to talk with you.